Okay, well, welcome to this Dionysius Circle event, everyone. My name is Sam Bennett, and today we are privileged to delve into Torstein's Tollefsen's new book, The Christian Metaphysics of St. Maximus the Confessor. We are joined by Professor Tollefsen himself, along with esteemed scholars Sotiris Mitralexis and Jonathan Bieler. So, a brief introduction for our panelists. Torstein is a professor at the University of Oslo. Sotiris serves as a visiting professor at the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge, and Jonathan Bieler is an assistant professor at the John Paul II Institute in Washington, D.C. And so I'll be moderating the discussion today, and our format is going to go like this. So first we'll have Torstein provide an introduction to his book and topic, and then following this we'll enter a discussion segment where our panelists and audience members are welcome to contribute. Then we'll have maybe like a 5-minute coffee break, and then next Jonathan will present his remarks, leading into an open discussion with Torstein, likely to be the first to respond if he wants. And then lastly, we'll have Sotiris will share his insights, and then followed by another round of open discussion. Again, with Torstein having the opportunity to respond, but all audience members are able in each of these discussion sections to be engaged. And so in general, the aim for this event is to be relaxed, conversational. Everyone's participation, including the audience, right, and thoughts are highly encouraged. And so, because we believe this approach will foster kind of productive insights. That's the kind of the goal, productive insights into Maximus's work. And then, and just before passing the floor to Torstein, I just want to express my profound gratitude to you, Torstein, and Sotiris and Jonathan for your participation, as well as to our audience for joining us. Your active participation is really greatly appreciated, and it's going to enrich the event. All right, so with that being said, Torstein, please take it away.
Thank you. I have to imagine that I am in front of a group of students, because it's if not, it's very difficult to focus, I think, and speak freely. Well, I present in this book what I think is the Christian metaphysics of St. Maximus the Confessor. And in introduction, I appeal to the classical definitions of what metaphysics is in Aristotle, that you eventually ask questions about the origin of the cosmos, and that you ask questions about God as the first cause, and the divine principles behind the realm of beings. And I also try to argue that there is such a thing as a Christian philosophy, not simply in late antiquity, but even today. And then the book has 7 chapters. The first 2 is about the knowledge. The first chapter is about what I call Maximus' epistemology, in which I try to show that, according to Maximus, if you are going to have a proper view of reality, you have to develop virtues and eventually enter into contemplation and see the world from the point of view of the Creator. And if you do not do that, you will have a superficial relationship with beings, and you will probably, your relationship will be dominated by passions. So one has to free oneself from passions in order to enter into contemplation and see the world from the point of view of the logoi, which I shall return to. The second chapter is about knowledge of God. I'm not going to say much about that. I found it very difficult to move into, but I think I learned a lot when trying. So it's much on the Trinity and what kind of knowledge we may have of God and God as Trinity. And then in the third chapter, naturally, I go to creation, because part of metaphysics as I said in Aristotle, is that ask for the first principle of the cosmos, and in the Christian context, of course, this will be trying to explain how Maximus, in this case, understands the creation of the world. And then I try to put them into context of late antique discussions about this topic of creation. But maybe the fourth chapter is the most important one of the most important ones for me, because it is about the so-called logos and logoi. The principles, the divine principles behind the creation of the world are the divine logoi, which I consider to be divine ideas. I know that some people object to that, but I do not. I think it is a doctrine of divine ideas, even though more dynamically expressed or developed than in any other author that I know of. But the logoi are, so to say, divine definitions, eternal divine definitions or conceptions of what beings are to be, essentially. I also have a chapter, the fifth, about the relation between logoi and so-called divine activities, which is, I think, a rather obscure and difficult topic. And I'm not going to comment more on that now. But very important for me is the sixth chapter on so-called universals, because I think that the logoi, they are principles for creating an ordered cosmos that takes the form of a whole part structure, in which parts, individuals, particulars, belong to species, species to genera. And the species and genera are not, in my opinion, some kind of Platonic ideas between God and the world. They are what one calls them nowadays, at least some people I know talk about immanent universals. So there's some kind of immanent universal structure in the cosmos, binding everything together and eventually connecting everything into the basic divine institution of essence. I call this system a holomeristic system, from the Greek words of whole and part, holos and meros. And I think this is, so to say, what is established in the created world on the basis of the logoi. So it's an immanent system. And then I also have a chapter on the seventh chapter on the incarnation and on deification, treated from a philosophical and metaphysical point of view, which means that, of course, there are some things that that I don't treat, like will, for instance, which is going to be a topic for a conference in Budapest next week. And logos tropos, the tropos dimension is not mentioned, but I try to show how the incarnate Christ becomes the real microcosm of the created world. Not only is he the one who contains all the logoi of creation, he is also incarnate in human nature, which is described in Ambiguum 41 as a kind of microcosm. So God acts as a redeemer, entering into the world as a human being, and, so to say, creates the conditions for the regeneration of all being. And in the last part of the book, the eighth chapter, so to say, the corollaries, I just try to show that Maximus' philosophy is could be relevant when it comes to environmental issues today, and that his metaphysics, as I understand it, can be made relevant today. But of course, that needs a lot of argument in order to establish that on a secure basis. Despite the fact that there are some typos, which is called today, and the fact that there are obscurities, I've just read through the book, there are obscurities. I think I also discovered one inconsistency, but I'm not sure. And despite the fact that each chapter can be developed into a book on its own, I found it rather stimulating to read through the book once more. Even though this topic of the so-called logoi and activities, or energies as many people call them, I still find that a bit difficult, and maybe that needs to be rethought by me, I suppose. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Torstein, for that. Those introductory remarks. Appreciate you kind of giving us that overview of the book. That's great. Yeah, so like I said, we'll kind of just now open it up for discussion. Of course, Jonathan, Sotiris, you're welcome to come in, but anyone in the audience, if anyone has a question for Torstein at this point, we can begin there. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I could maybe start off if I see another hand. Yeah. So Torstein, could you mentioned how you like to think of the logi as divine ideas, but you mentioned how there's in some ways this is you think of the logi and Maximus as consistent with the previous philosophical history in certain ways, but then you mentioned that there is something novel about his position, which has to do with having this active or developmental character to the divine logi. So, would you mind just commenting on that? Just thought be curious to hear you talk a little bit about that novel element within Maximus's theory.
It seems to me that some people nurture the notion that when you talk about divine ideas, you talk about something very static in the mind of God. And I think somehow in Maximus as well, according to the seventh ambiguum, the logoi are divine preconceptions, so to say, predefinitions of what beings are to be. But he develops the logos of a being into a triad of logos of being, of well-being, and of eternal well-being, which means somehow that there is a more dynamic structure built into this his theory of the logoi. So a being is created as something predefined by God, but it is also created with the potential to develop in a certain way in the direction of glorification or deification. And I think that this idea of deification and glorification of beings is not just to do with human beings, but that all being, that every being in the world is, so to say, destined for this development into deification and glorification. So I think there is no waste in the cosmos of Maximus, which means that all being is destined to a glorious end.
It's so and just a real quick follow-up on that. I mean, so you would think of Maximus as a type of universalist in that respect, right? That all being. I mean, because of course someone could say, there obviously some people take the position that God desires maybe, or in some sense wants all to be saved or everything to be glorified, but that maybe for whatever reason there's not in fact that universal glorification. But you would say for Maximus that there is in fact that universal glorification.
That's a very important topic, because I think what I say in the corollaries at the end of the book is that this idea of universal transformation has to do with all created things, all species, all particulars of species, even though the question of eternal damnation is an open one for me, at least. I don't know how I shall understand that. I read parts of what Ilaria Ramelli has written about universal salvation, and I see that she also in the short book mentions me when it comes to Maximus. But I've never said anything about that, anything definitely about that, because I find it a very difficult question. So, I mean, the universalism, so to say, for me is, how should I put it, metaphysical. It contains all kinds of beings, but I don't know whether it contains all particulars. I found that a challenging, interesting topic, but I haven't gone through it systematically.
Okay, interesting. That's interesting distinction. Oh yeah, please, someone jump in. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Tollefsen. I found your book extremely helpful. It was really helpful in terms of the logoi and other subjects. On page 108, I think, or 103, you make the distinction between principles of knowledge and principles of making. And that made me think whether there's any evidence in Maximus of a distinction between God thinking about all that could be made versus, well, let me rephrase it. Did God create everything that could be made, or only a subset? And if so, what are the grounds of that decision? I think Aquinas makes that distinction in the divine ideas, the divine exemplars. But is there any evidence that Maximus thought that only a subset of his thoughts were instantiated?
I think at least there is a crumble, a small indication of that he creates a subset. Because he says, I don't recall exactly where it is now, but he suggests that God did not, there are no logoi for things God did not want to create, which seems to me to indicate that God knew infinitely many possibilities, but there are only logoi for that set, which it decides to create. And then, of course, you come to a topic which I'm going to talk about next week in Budapest. Could God have decided not to create the world? And I think the answer is yes, he could have decided not to create the world. But why? Well, if, just as a matter of hypothesis, if God decided, if God contemplated and saw that none of the infinitely many sets of possibilities would be good for the creatures, then he could have decided not to create the world. Something like that. But I think there is a subset, almost like Leibniz, if not exactly like Leibniz, but in the gate of Leibniz.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Andrew. Jack, you want to jump in?
Yeah, hey, thanks for the talk. I'm wondering on that point, so how would you respond to somebody who would say something like, well, it's just God's nature as the good to sort of create, and so even if there are no maybe possible sets that are good for the creature or for the creature, doesn't his nature as goodness have to sort of go over and not extrinsically necessary creation, but just in virtue of his nature, he has to sort of share it What do you think about that idea?
I think that is extremely difficult to answer, but I'm working on a paper on this topic. Could God have decided not to create the world? I think I just have to stick to the answer that I gave, that if none of the subsets would be good for creatures, God could have decided not to create. I don't think that God is coerced, of course not from outside, but even from inside, even though this is very difficult to talk about, since we have to, take into consideration that God is infinite, eternal. We are talking about something that is timeless, and therefore it's, philosophically speaking, very difficult to reach some kind of clear notion of it, it seems to me. Would you follow up?
Yeah, I've just been wrestling with Aquinas's thoughts on this in his commentary on Dionysius, and yeah, I mean, I agree with what you say, and I don't know. I mean, it seems like there's something about goodness that is sort of sharing. So maybe I would just say that there are no sets that are just totally not good for the creature. I mean, what would you think that something like that would consist of, if anything?
I really don't know. I think somehow if God contemplates an infinite number of possible essences, there are also immediately paradoxes, of course, an infinite number of essences and an infinite number of combinations, an infinite number of possible in the world, so to say. All this is very tricky. There is something, when I consider this concept of divine goodness, it seems to be very difficult to come to the conclusion that God could have decided not to create the world. But even so, I think that just to contemplate different essences in combination, seeing that in a temporal sequence, certain combinations would not be particularly successful, would not in any sense detract from God's goodness. And also, I think that one aspect that is very important is, of course, human free will, which comes into this picture, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So then, kind of sidetracking off of that, with the creation that he did decide to create, I mean, would you be committed to sort of a more Leibnizian view where it is the best of all the sets, or that he could have done better but chose for some reason that we don't know that to make this reality?
I think I think that my opinion is that God has to look at this as the best possible, with all the problems that follow in that train, of course.
Yeah. I was just reading the Ambiguum the other day on how he's responding to Nazianzus on matter. So then, would you maybe kind of talk about in response to that? Would you talk about like Maximus's theodicy, or how he would deal with the problem of evil if this is the sort of best possible world? Because I know in a Leibnizian view, it gets complicated, but.
I think there is a passage in the 10th Ambiguum where Maximus says that he thinks everything that happens for the best, even though the reasons are beyond our grasp. And he also has some a rather lengthy paragraph, I think, in which he talks about all the differences that enters into the cosmos, which is impossible for us to overview. And it seems to me that he, as far as I know at least, he doesn't say much more than that. But we are, of course, left with the problem of evil.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, this has given me some good stuff to think about for my reading. So
Good.
Can I interject here or ask a question?
Absolutely, yeah.
When it comes to the question of goodness of God, I mean, it seems like this question comes in when thinking about the infinite possibilities God has in his mind, the infinite ideas. As soon as you think of it in this way, it becomes a question, well, or it can become a question that if God doesn't realize all his possibilities, maybe he's lacking something, right? So if he's already limiting the amount of possibilities that he's going to actualize, what happens to his perfection and so on. I mean, I'm not in this respect, the question of the goodness of God, I find really important that in your book, on my page 67, in this chapter on the knowledge of God, you make very clear that the first principle of Maximus' system is the Christian God, the Trinity, right? So it's not the essence or the possibilities of God or the ideas of God that seem to be. This seems to be what you're saying is first comes the Trinity, as it were. And could you maybe say a bit more about how that affects our understanding of God's goodness when it comes to how Maximus understands?
Yes, maybe I should try. Of course, there is a major difference, it seems to me, that between, let's say, the deities, the gods of pagan philosophy, and the Maximian Christian God. And that has to do with, well, the divine will to communicate himself to things that are not God, to creatures. And then we enter into the real, let's say, problems or scandals or whatever about Christianity. Because if God decided in his goodness to create the world that was best, which I think it must be out of the question, at least if you follow one path of thinking, then you have to reckon with the God that is willing to enter the cosmos and suffer for it, which of course is very un-Hellenic, at least from a philosophical point of view. So I think that divine goodness should be, maybe that is not as clearly put in the book, but divine goodness has to be understood in relation to the Trinitarian project of creation and salvation. What do you think, Jonathan? Is it, could you sharpen your question? Or?
Yeah, though, I mean, I was thinking also about the immanent Trinity first, if so, or in what sense do you mean first principle? Do you mean it as economic Trinity, or is there a sense of the first principle, the Trinity being the immanent Trinity? And because you seem to, on the next page, say something like, you're saying at the end of this section, the Trinity is a perfect image of love right? 3 consubstantial hypostases, internally consolidated in mutual love. And that is a reassuring image. Why is it reassuring? You know, is it economically reassuring, or what do you epistemologically reassuring?
Let me just say economically reassuring.
I mean, I guess I wanted to look at what Maximus says in Ambiguum 1, for example. It's a very short Ambiguum, but there he seems to kind of say that the Trinity is already the full realization of God's goodness, right? So God doesn't have to create in order to be something or have something that is lacking in terms of goodness. Or, I mean, what do you think about that?
No, I see a bit more of what you are intending. Well, yes. Well, I think that maybe, okay, it's reassuring when it comes to the immanent Trinity, even though I'm not very familiar with the terms immanent and what was the other one? Economic Trinity.
Economic is just the Trinity going out of itself in creation and saving. So creating and saving are activities
just the things I've been writing about.
Yeah, so to the outside. And then immanent is the Trinity, let's say, apart, looked apart from creation in intrinsic.
Okay, but even though this is very difficult, I mean, can you separate those two aspects? I don't think we can. I mean, what is inside is expressed in the goodness of what is created or is taken into the divine economy. There is a hidden source. Okay, there is a hidden source about which you cannot know anything at all. But even so, what is outside springs from that inner source, which seems very reassuring, at least. But then, of course, the cross and I mean the Christ event with the cross and the resurrection becomes very important, of course, in this picture.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, immanent and economic, not in the sense of separation at all. Like Rahner would say, for example, the immanent Trinity is the economic Trinity. So there's identity, in a sense, but I guess it's more of a distinction in union. Because if they're strictly the same, then creation is necessary, right? In a Hegelian sense, I guess, if I don't want to use that name, throw that name in there. But, I don't want to hog the conversation.
What?
I don't want to hog the conversation, No. I still have to make a presentation too. So
that's right. Thanks, Jonathan. Though, yeah, I mean, maybe before we move on to the next phase of the discussion, if anyone wants to have last question for Torstein.
I'm very interested in what you said about evolutionary biology throughout your book, especially in the last chapters. Happens to be my area of interest, my work on Maximus and evolution. And I just wondered what you thought about the immanence of the logoi giving a dignity to evolution that we don't often see in more kind of participatory accounts or accounts of God where he's more transcendent and distant, orchestrating evolution from afar, as opposed to Maximus's idea of the logoi determining everything in a dynamic fashion from the most generic genus down to the particulars, from within, as it were, living out evolution himself as the Logos. To me, that is very powerful, because it's saying that, you know, nature is itself fundamentally evolutionary, leaving aside all the pain and suffering. And so it dignifies all of those intermediate, transitional, ephemeral states, as well as humankind, all of the extinct species, 99.9% of species that have gone extinct, they're all imbued by the Logos. I wondered what you thought of that kind of sentiment.
Well, I don't think that you can find this in Maximus, of course, because he lived in an age where evolution, the notion of evolution did not exist at all. But even so, I think this is a very fruitful way to develop him and to use his thoughts into solving modern problems, at least from a theological point of view, to handle, treat, discuss modern challenges. So I find that very fruitful. And I know that someone is going, isn't you?
It's me, yes.
Planning a book?
Yes.
Is it? Ah, nice to see you.
Nice to meet you, yeah.
Very good indeed. I'm looking very much forward to that.
Great. Well, thanks for that question. Oh, Luke, did you want to? Yeah, we can get another question here, and we'll go to the next phase. Yeah.
Hi there. Yeah, if this is out of scope, feel free to just move on. I had a question that I've been kind of wondering about for a while, relating to the two energies of Christ, or two activities. So if you'd prefer not to talk about that, we can move on.
I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind.
Sure.
No, I see.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I have is that obviously before the incarnation, there are divine activities that the Logos is doing. When the Logos takes on flesh, is that human activity united to that original divine activity? For example, when the Logos works, let's say, providence or something like that, now that he has flesh, is there a human component to that, or is that something that is done, quote unquote, without, or sort of, yeah, I don't know how to even speak about it, but yeah, just interested in your thoughts.
Exactly what is your question?
How do activities that were pre-incarnate, how does that relate to, does now the human activity of Christ play a role in that, in the sort of new mode of activity, or something like that?
Yeah, if I understand what you mean, I think you are talking about something very central, I think, in the chapter I wrote on incarnation and deification. I'm not sure that I will say that I got that I presented it in a very clear way there, but it has been in my mind for some time, and I've written also a couple of chapters or books, I think, on Maximus and deification, and this question of the relation between the two activities, so the divine and the human, in the incarnate Christ. I've tried to ponder that a bit, and I found it very difficult, because it seems to me that somehow you have to keep the two sides of the two activities, or the two natures, somehow distinct. Let me say somehow distinct, even though I think that this should be regulated by the Chalcedonian adverbs. But I mean, you still have a problem philosophically, it seems to me. It seems to me somehow that you can describe that situation as if you spilled oil on water, because they will not mix. And I think, is that all? And the only way I found, at least so far, not out of the dilemma, but at least a step forward, I hope, is to go to the examples and metaphors that Maximus uses. The sword that is glowing because it is in the furnace. It is glowing, the glowing sword, in which it is. I mean, you perceive just one phenomenon, one striking and frightening phenomenon, and it seems that the two dimensions of cutting and burning somehow mix into one another, but as being a metaphor, I suppose that here I find it at least difficult myself to penetrate into that metaphor with my philosophical tools and, so to say, start separating again. It seems to me that somehow here there is a mystery which I at least find very difficult to untangle. But metaphysically, I think it's very important, because theologically as well, of course, soteriologically.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if, you know, if we ever get to that answer more clearly, I'm wondering if that has ecclesiological implications as well.
That may
But
be.
yeah, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Jonathan, do you have
may I follow up a bit on this, Sam?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I mean,
please.
as to whether I don't use a camera because it slows down my speed, but I mean, as to what extent the incarnation in a way affects the manner of performing human activity or divine. I would like to ask Torstein, because actually me too, in preparation of Budapest, I've been pondering a bit about how does he, whether he takes as it is the Dionysian notion of the new theandric activity, which is mentioned in the end of fourth letter, where Dionysius explicates that this new theandric activity is not of a kind of performing the divine in a divine manner, nor the human in a humane manner, but it's a new divine theandric activity. And then it struck me because Samuel Florovsky says that this sentence was used by Severus, and of course, this is well known that in that extent Dionysius was argued to be in the quiver of the Monophysites. But would it be the case that St. Maximus here reads this new theandric activity in this duality of the distinction mentioned of the human and the divine? And then in that case, and connecting to the previous question, one should see the human acting of Christ as supplement to his divine acting as God-man, and in no way as hindering whatsoever his divine activity.
I think that the answer to that will be the answer I gave just now. I cannot see what else I can say. The two activities, they are incarnational, of course. They are in the incarnate Christ, which means that since he emptied himself and came into the world, he acts as if or being a human being, as Maximus says. He became a human being in all his nature. And he performs divine activities in a human mode and human activities in a divine mode. The thing I find very difficult to understand is, of course, exactly how this happens. That's why I also talked about this sword immersed in fire. I don't think I can elaborate any further on that.
Can I jump in here? So in Ambiguum 5, no, where this is all discussed,
Yeah.
In extenso, Maximus also, besides using the image of the sword, the burning sword, he uses the image of Christ walking on the water.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, why that? You know, there's so many other things he could say. But there he says it's walking on the water. It's walking, that's the human activity, right? But then walking on the water, that's sort of an expression or a sign that a divine activity is at work as well, right? Somehow. I mean, have you thought about? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think that the reason why I took up that particular example from the Gospels is probably because someone had done it before. I mean, I think it had been discussed by several other authors as well. So it became a text like, for instance, Gethsemane and walking on water. I think they are very typical in some of these discussions. Yeah. He's eating and drinking in a divine manner. He is healing sick sick people in a human manner. I mean, all of these things, so to say, combine the two activities, but exactly how they are combined and where they meet and how they are united without being mixed together seems very difficult to imagine, at least for me.
Oh, another thing that he emphasizes that I also find fascinating is that bringing together of opposites, no, in his acting. So when he walks on the water, he says, no, he brings things together that are opposite, like the instability of the water and the stable surface you walk on. He brings things together that naturally wouldn't come together this way. So that by nature this wouldn't happen sort of points to a kind of divine power who can. But for me, that's a very interesting question. How do we recognize the divinity in Christ's humanity? Well, I think that's my constant question.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan and Panagiotis and Luke, for those comments and questions. How about now maybe we'll take a 5-minute coffee break, come back at 55, and then Jonathan, if you want to give some remarks, and then we'll have another round of discussion. All right. Thanks, everyone. Great. I guess we'll get started up again. So this part, we're just, Jonathan will have a few remarks for us, and then we'll just, go into another round of discussion. So take it away, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you very much also for the invitation to be here. So a really pleasure to discuss this book. I mean, I haven't really something written out totally, so forgive me if this is not entirely thought through 100%. But in light of the book and that the book is the subject, I want to present this as a kind of a way of understanding the book, and please let me know if this is totally wrong or if I'm missing major things here, which I'm sure I do. At least one angle that I found helpful in situating the book and understanding it better is sort of in general the question of causality. So and I think it's important to see that, at least it was for me, and I hope it is important, that Metropolitan Zizioulas is an important conversation partner for you, Torstein. So in light of what you could frame maybe a debate between you two. I mean, there's this book from 2012 that was published, and he has an article, and you have one on hypostasis and nature. For this conference bound from the conference in Belgrade 2012, and there seemed to be Zizioulas' view of, let's say, the causality of the hypostasis. By causality I mean how does something come into being? And he seems to say that it is Maximus's view that the nature, the ousia, the common does not give being. So for me, that means it doesn't really cause the hypostasis. And he says as much later when he says, what gives being is the hypostasis. Hypostasis is what causes nature to exist, right? And so it seems to be that he's, the personalist he is, I guess he identifies causality with the side of the person, as it were. And nature, ousia, is simply denoting what is common in the sense of universal, koinon, the ontological status of which is purely abstract, secondary, intellectual. Maybe he's thinking also of Cyril of Alexandria, saying we can only distinguish the natures in theory, in contemplation. So if that's what nature is, ontologically speaking, then there's not much room for causality there. It's just us abstracting that nature from the thing that's already there. But how that thing is already there hasn't become quite clear to me, how the hypothesis is there for Zizioulas, how it's caused, like metaphysically speaking. And I think that's sort of the new approach, is to show that there is a way in which causality is enacted by way of ousia, by way of the nature, by way of this interrelationship, this motion between the universal and the particular. I think so. Maybe that's also why the holomerism, or the holomeristic view that you so expertly give an account of in your book, in chapter 6, why that has a relevance for the constitution of the hypostasis, right? Because then you would say, if I understand you correctly, and you make that claim a couple of times in the book, the hypostasis is, as it were, just the nature as it is situated in being, something like that. So it's in that context of that debate that your emphasis on the causative role of not only the universals and their relationship to the particular, but also the logoi, not only as principles of knowing, but also as principle of making, become important. So it's not just an intellectual sphere, or it doesn't just belong to the order of predication. This whole framework of the genus and the species and the motion between them, but it's actually the way in which, and I think that's your thesis, being is given to the hypothesis, to the particular. And you do express your frustration at some point, because Maximus doesn't seem to go in Ambiguum 7, I think it is, all the way down to the actual hypothesis. He speaks of the eidos, the most specific eidos, no? As Porphyry does. Why doesn't he go all the way to the hypothesis? So I find that the question of causality and how the hypothesis is constituted metaphysically, what are the constitutive principles of the hypothesis, and what important role is played by the ousia. I find that very helpful, how you, in your book, give an account of this. Yeah, so, but then I wonder, and I hope this makes sense, then I wonder, there is this claim that Zizioulas makes, now that hypothesis cannot be simply identified with automon, individual. And he takes that claim, at least in that article, and then argues that hypothesis is something really on the other side of individualized substance. And why is that? Right? Because that's sort of when he then says, it's the hypothesis that gives being, and individualization is not enough, doesn't cause anything, as it were, maybe. That's not to say that nature doesn't have a positive role in Zizioulas. I'm really not an expert on Zizioulas, because it founds, as it were, the communion among the beings, right? So I don't want to criticize Zizioulas. I just find it interesting to look at the debate. My question is, how does this all fit with Christology? Yeah, as it were, with the ontology of the hypothesis of Christ. So, because if the hypothesis of the creature is constituted by, as it were, a motion down from the most universal into the most particular, what's different about Christ's hypothesis? Is it constituted the same way? But Maximus seems to say, at least in this text that Zizioulas quotes, which is Opusculum 16, where he says that automon is not identical with Christ's hypothesis. He says there actually automon is not identical with Christ's composite hypothesis, right? So Christ's composite hypothesis is a case of, yeah, a special case of hypothesis. And how does it sort of fit in with the rest of the metaphysics of Maximus, which is Christocentric? Right? What difference does the composite hypothesis make? Why is it composite? These were sort of my question. You know, how do you integrate the metaphysics with the Christology, and then also with the Trinitarian theology? Because it seems to me Maximus is really concerned with that integration. And that's one of his main themes. Also against the monophysites, no, because he wants to keep the terminology straight. So anyway, I hope that was intelligible.
Yeah, that was great, Jonathan. Thank you very much for those remarks. It's a really interesting way of situating Torstein's book. Yeah, Torstein, do you want to start with some thoughts in response to Jonathan? Or?
it was very complex, I would say, and a lot of things to I mean, keep clear in your mind. Well, first and foremost, I have not I'm not I'm not a personalist in Sosura's way or seeing it. No, I see that you got that quite clearly. Yeah, and it seems to me that at least the Maximus' notion of ousia, essence or substance, is not a notion of an abstract universal at all. I found one place in the commentary on the Lord's Prayer, which seems to indicate rather clearly that he considers the divine ousia as being a productive power of being, not just something abstract you can predicate on a set of individuals or particulars. But then, of course, how do we understand then the triad, the Trinity? I mean, this is not like anything at all that we have experienced with in our ordinary life, and in our classifications and things around us. It seems to be some kind of we are trying to come to terms with something that is beyond our grasp. But I do not believe that the source of God, the Trinity, is the hypostasis. I cannot see that I find that in Maximus, neither in the church fathers that I have read. But then it becomes rather difficult to express exactly what it is all about. This is a topic for a seminar. I don't think I should say more for the time being. Maybe Jonathan will.
I mean, no. I mean, maybe it's. I mean, my yeah, my question was also or I didn't want us to go all the way into the Trinity, right? I mean, there's
Good.
I think that yeah, then we do have to have a seminar for sure.
Yeah,
I was just thinking of it on the level of created being. First, look, know that there is a kind of way in which Maximus thinks of the causation of a particular being by way of being circumscribed, right? Which seems to be just a logical framework. You predicate universals of a particular, then you seem to be just moving back and forth, and that just seems to be a kind of an intellectual movement.
Yeah.
But what you seem to be saying is that there's more than just a logical kind of movement.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think I belong to that generation of interpreters of Aristotle that thinks that the form in matter is somehow an individualized universal. So universals are somehow immanent in the Aristotelian conception. I don't think that forms in the Aristotelian sense are particular forms, which seems to be the modern trend in Aristotle scholarship. So I stick to the more conservative view. I think that what individualizes something is matter. So forms are in principle universals. And then there has arisen this notion of the immanent universal, which is defended, I think, by Christoph Erisman and Sebastian Matiesco, blant annet. And I find that interpretation interesting and satisfactory. I'm a realist myself. And, well, so I think that then what is a hypostasis? It seems to me that hypostasis, and please object to this, hypostasis is individualized or particularized universal in a sense. It's a instantiation of something universal. So it's a way of existing somehow.
Yeah, I think that's it's a good question. I think it's not very helpful to. I think you're saying that too. Is that to sort of oppose the two too much? But maybe it's helpful. I mean, I look at Maximus also from later developments of this sort of question, also in Christian philosophy, like Aquinas and Boethius before Maximus. I can see that the hypostasis offers a kind of subsistence, and that's, I think, a helpful word, subsistence, as the actual being there, the actual stable ground, as it were, of a thing that makes it be. But then the metaphysics of that is how is being communicated to that subsistence? Or in other words, I found it helpful to distinguish between subsistence and existence or being. Also, existence is maybe not a great word, but in Aquinas, we have this distinction between esse, right, being, to be, and subsistence, the ends, the subsistent being. And for him, it is possible that esse is not subsistent. But that doesn't mean that it's not, as it were, a constitutive principle, a causative principle that's necessary for that subsistent being to be, right? But it's not the case that we then say, well, esse is, right? It's the cause of the being of the ends, but it's not, it is not itself. Like Boethius says, running itself does not run, but it's still kind of a reality that includes in an intensive way the reality that follows after it, or that it is a causative principle of.
I think that I see something similar in Maximus. I cannot say that it is identical, of course, because that requires a lot more work and discussion. But I mean, I think there is a distinction between the logos and the activity, or logoi and activities. And activities are the divine acts ad extra, with which, in accordance with which he creates, he lets entities, a hypostasis, be or be good, and so on. So that is somehow, to use the term commonly used, which no one then can be very useful, I suppose, it's some kind of energizing of a hypostasis. Hypostasis emerges at the moment when God wants this hypostasis to be. And the to be is, so to say, the activity or the energy, as which at this moment I think would be appropriate.
I think it's key then that Maximus insists so much on the fact that this energeia belongs on the side of nature in a general sense.
Yeah.
Of course, then it is the person that enacts that energeio in a certain way, a certain tropos, but he firmly locates it on the side of nature as well. So that seems to suggest that there is this kind of causation, communication of being going on. That's ultimately points to the personal, right, enactment of that being. So it's not natural in the sense of necessary, right, and limiting and constricting freedom, but it's more enabling freedom, which I found really came out for me in your book very nicely.
Good. Anyone want to come in with a comment or a question?
I was wondering what you thought of the idea that created hypostasis is instantiation in a finite mode of existence, tropos hypoxios. But Maximus also talks about there being a logos of hypostasis. So it's as if even that act of instantiation itself is logoi determined. So whereas a hypostasis seems to be devoid of any intelligible content, it's a bit like a placeholder, a receptacle or a vehicle or a platform to kind of house intelligible content. But in it itself, though, is defined by God as a logos of hypostasis.
Maybe you're right. I should just have to think about that. It sounded very well put, I think.
I mean, if I may,
yeah, Jonathan, yeah,
interject, if I may. I find it really helpful that you mentioned the logos of hypostasis as a divine idea. So that to me means that the hypostasis doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? Not just an empty receptacle that's kind of absolute out there, empty, already existent or subsistent in a way, and then creation is just sort of the filling that empty space with something, and then that's I think it's much more a Platonic way of then thinking about creation as more giving order to something that's already there, but kind of empty and chaotic, if you want to use that word. But the logos of hypostasis will point to the fact that God really wants to communicate his being all the way down, right? That's something that even that comes from him and is embedded in that causative motion.
Yeah. No comment.
I think it's interesting. Maybe I'll jump in here. The idea of communication of being, of God's being. Specifically, I'm thinking about maybe you're familiar with there's a contemporary analytic philosopher, Josh Rasmussen, who's done some work on personhood. And in his recent book on that, he presents what he calls the construction problem, which is how would even God create a person in the sense of something that is a subjective point of experience. How would God go about creating something like that? Because he points out that, if you try to imagine you know, like if you were tasked with, I want you to, you know, science project, you know, I want you to go out and make a person out of sticks, you know, you're gonna have some trouble because it doesn't seem like matter is the right material, that you could never, even God could arrange matter in the right way to get a center of subjective experience and awareness. So anyway, he calls it a construction problem. And this leads him to argue that, well, it seems like actually to get a person, God would have to communicate his own being. So, in other words, the very the mental or intellectual nature of God would have to be communicated from himself to a person, and so anyway, I just bring that up as I'm kind of curious, yeah, if that's relevant to this issue of universals having causal power. It seems like at the level of creating a person, maybe something more radical is needed, you know, namely like the communication of God's own intellectual substance, as it were, rather than maybe the usage of a universal. I'm not sure if that makes much sense, but yeah, if anyone has any thoughts about that.
I don't think I'm able to comment with any insight on that. It was rather interesting, of course, but this is one of the points that I think needs at least further consideration from my part.
One of the interesting things about the logoi doctrine is that there's no mediating terms as there are in sort of Neoplatonic emanation. The logos is the logoi and the logoi are the logos.
Yes.
So that seems to me that creation is vested with God, a kind of personhood which is much more profound and mysterious than participatory accounts that we see in later scholastic treatments.
Yeah, I agree.
Also has significance for you know, environmental stewardship and
yeah,
the theophanic nature of everything and the sanctity of nature.
Yeah. I also often wondered about the following. I'm not sure if that is relevant either. I didn't comment on it in the book, but is there such a thing as created essay or being? Or is the being of beings the divine energy? And I admit that I have once written somewhere, probably in the first Maximus book from 2008, that there doesn't seem to be any created being in the sense of essay in Latin, but everything exists because of God's. And here I think the term energy could be appropriate for once. I'm not very fond of the term, but here I think it's illuminating somehow. The energizing principle of createdness is God's own action, so to say.
Would you agree that God,
So
according to Maximus, is beyond being and therefore imparticiple, and it's the energies therefore that are participated in?
Yes, I think that is the case. I think it says that rather clearly.
So again, that's another, I keep mentioning this difference between scholasticism and participation, because for Aquinas, there's participation of being as well as in form, whereas it would seem to me that with Maximus, there's no participation in being because that's impossible, but there is a co-inherence of form. The logoi are vested in creation without diminution. So the logos is the logoi. There's no attenuation of the divine ideas. What you see is what you get for Maximus. You know, God's ideas exactly represented in nature. But what safeguards that against a kind of pantheism is the fact that being, qua being, is imparticipable and completely, there's like a chasm, total alterity in being. That's my interpretation. I don't know if I'm.
If I may, you actually have a very helpful section in your book on this question, though, when you talk about apophaticism and transcendence in the second chapter on the knowledge of God. This proemium or prologue to the Mystagogy, by Maximus, is a very helpful text.
Yeah.
Because there, yes, he says God is beyond being, and is in that sense non-being compared to created being. But then also he actually also says, and I think these things always have to be held together, I think, as you say as well, that we can also say he is being, and compared to him, everything else is non-being. So it's the chasm on the one hand, but it's also the point that God is the source of all being.
Could I ask a question? I think I have made a point of this Plotinian distinction between the activity of the essence and the activity out of the essence, because I think it's very useful in interpreting, for instance, Maximus. It seems to me that the activity of the essence, which is triadically constituted, somehow is, of course, beyond what we can understand, but in a sense, very edifying if you think of it as a distribution of love or whatever inside the Trinity itself. But I think this activity out of the essence seems to me very important in this regard, because that is somehow a manifestation of being making, good making, etc., wisdom making, whatever, which is what makes beings be or good or wise or whatever. Then you can keep, can't you, the divine being as such outside of the realm of participation. You don't participate in the inner being of God at all, but beings may participate in what is manifested out of God. I think that is very useful for me, at least. I'm not sure whether you.
Yeah, Jack, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that that's much. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that that's much different from Aquinas's approach, because Aquinas is pretty clear that, and he says a passage in the Tertia Pars, ironically enough, when he's commenting on the hypostatic union, that God immediately touches, and he uses the word touches. I forgot the Latin, but immediately touches all things to make them to be. And so for Aquinas' schema, it seems that God remains unparticipated qua the formal cause of things. And he's explicit in the Gentiles and elsewhere that the divine essence never constitutes the formality of a creature, that there is a created esse, but the created esse is just sustained by God's efficient causality. And so there's ex nihilo, a created esse, where God creates that, but always sustains that. And it seems to me that what Aquinas is saying is just that we never participate in the divine essence itself, but we're always reliant upon God as a power for all things to be. I mean, does that sound like what you're getting at, or is it a bit different?
No, I think you come rather close. I think there seems to be some slight small difference somewhere, which has to be pondered a bit more, I think. But even so, it strikes me as not that different.
Yeah, because I mean, I gave a paper earlier last year on Maximus at a conference, and to prepare for it, I was reading Eric Pearl's dissertation, and it seems like in his interpretation of the logoi that he really wants to say that there is no that we do participate directly in, at least in Maximus's system, that we do participate directly in the divine essence. And he explicitly singles out Aquinas on this and saying, going against what I'm saying. And so I guess you take a sort of different approach and say that, yeah, the divine essence does remain unparticipated. And I think that that would safeguard God's immutability as well.
I think one kind of test of the difference between Aquinas and Maximus will be to ask the question whether Aquinas thinks that being is an on-off property, as it were. You either exist or you don't in that mode of existence, or whether it's a variable thing. And I'm not an Aquinas expert at all, but it seems to me from what little I've read is that he would think that being as well as form is a continuous variable. Some grades of being are higher than others that participate more closely in God than others. Whereas from what I've read of Maximus, mode of being is variable for human beings because of the exercise of their free will to become more in tune or out of tune with their logos. But for everything else, it's like it's in a fixed mode of existence. And the differences between things are more to do with their logoi content, as it were, their formal attributes, rather than their existence, which is like fixed as a finite mode of existence. Again, I might be wrong, but that's how I've come to kind of rationalize these things.
I think with respect to Aquinas, it seems like you're on the right track. I think that's what I've come across as well. The angels exist definitely in a higher mode. I mean, there's definitely like a graded aspect based upon their respective form, matter, essence, as a constituent parts.
Well, I'm not an Aquinas expert at all, so I've read a lot of Aquinas in earlier years, but that is very many years ago. But so I'm not qualified to comment on this.
I wonder if I could circle back to what Jonathan was talking about.
Yeah, Carson, please go ahead. And maybe this could be the last question, then we'll go on to Sotiris, your remarks. But yeah, take it away, Carson.
Well, if I recall, he was bringing up this question of the hypostasis and whether the hypostasis was really what's what holds the causation or the causal power for things, or whether it's the nature ousia. And it seems like we're circling around this question of the Porphyrian tree and what exactly it is in Maximus's version, which you do discuss in your book in a few places. I was reminded of that passage from Ambigua 41 where Maximus quotes Dionysius, which also appears to be sort of Procline, where the quote from Dionysius is basically talking about this cascading hierarchy of beings, where each higher level unifies the lower level, so makes the lower level to be one. And to the extent that it makes it to be one, it seems like it's causing the that lower level. And the levels are, he speaks of in the quote, it's that which is many by its parts is one in the whole, and that which is many by its accidents is one in the subject, and that which is many in number or potentialities is one in species, and that which is many by the species is one by the genus, and that which is many by the processions is one in its source. So it seems like you have the processions at the top, then genera, then species, then subjects, and accidents. So it seems like there's just a straightforward hierarchy of unity. I wonder, I mean, that to me just raises the question of, is Maximus, what's essentially making Maximus different than Dionysius? I mean, he quotes that quote from Dionysius, which would seem to suggest that the particulars or the subject gets its unity from a higher level, and then from that you could extrapolate and say, well, it's caused by that higher level. But then you have this whole other story that seems like the universals depend on the hypostasis, and maybe there's a more Aristotelian account where the hypostasis is more the thing that's more one, the subject. But then you have this quote from Dionysius that suggests that the subject's only unified by the higher genera. Anyway, I just maybe thought you could use that quote from Ambiguia 41 as a chance to comment on the distinction between Maximus and Dionysius on this question of the universal.
I'm not able to comment on that because I don't know Dionysius that well that I can speak about universal in him. But what I think is very important to notice, at least very basic from my understanding, is that all these structures of species and genera, and what in the deepest sense is the unity of everything, is immanent to each creature, to each hypostasis, which means that there are no higher levels except in the being of each constituted hypostasis.
What about so the genera would be within the hypostasis?
Yes.
But what about the processions?
Which processions are we talking about? The divine?
It seems that way.
I mean, if you this is Ambiguum 41. I mean, we have this passage of about the procession and good Lord, what is called again, distribution and contraction. Just before what you read, I suppose.
Yes.
And I think, well, that's well tricky, because it seems to me that Maximus talks about some kind of movement of essence. And if we should, and I have thought that if I should avoid Platonic interpretation in which you put certain levels of ideas between God and us, you have somehow to think about this movement as something that happens immanently in hypostasis. One of the things that is very important for me in this picture is that it seems that everything is interconnected somehow in the whole universe. I'm not sure that my comment is very helpful.
It seems to suggest maybe a more expansive view of hypostasis than maybe what we're used to. That would include this whole range of movement.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, as I said earlier, that this idea of an instantiation, hypostasis is an instantiation of all levels of specific and generic being. I mean, I'm a human being, I'm a primate, a mammal, and all these things somehow are inclusive circles, so to say.
What's strange is that he seems to suggest that the higher contains the lower. And if it's the genera is like
The
containing.
lower contains the higher, and probably the higher contains the lower as well, yes.
Okay.
I think that is a part of this holomeristic idea, which I tried to develop in the 6th chapter. Maybe I didn't put it clear enough, but maybe it wasn't that clear for me either. But yeah.
I need to go back and read that section. I guess the
That's I do it myself.
the kinds of containing would be different on each side, and then the question would be: is there a priority to either side of the containing as far as ontologically? Yeah,
that's interesting. That's good. I have to say that I have never been able to. I never had the possibility to discuss this holomeristic idea with anyone at all. I just figured it out and written about it in some papers. And now in this book, no one has ever commented on it, which is because of that is very important for me, of course, to get some questions about it and challenges about it.
Right.
Because I'm not going to give up the idea, but I'm going to refine it if I can.
That's what the Dionysius Circle is for. We'll discuss your.
Well, I guess maybe one instance would just be Christ himself as the hypostasis that contains the whole structure, the cosmic hierarchy of whole and part in his hypostasis. Yeah, so maybe it's just Christ, the Logos, is the one example we need to show how it works.
Yeah, it contains everything. I think so. That is also, I think, the ingenious idea of Maximus for how to regenerate all being, because everything is somehow brought together in Christ, in his humanity as well as in his divinity.
Right.
Okay, great. Well, I guess we'll shift into our third we'll go to remarks from Sotiris. But first, thanks a lot, Jonathan, for your remarks and bringing up this really interesting issue of the causal power of nature. See, that's really fascinating. So let's move on to Sotiris. So please, thank you, Sotiris, for doing this, and take it away.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Torstein, for writing the book, no less. I am of two minds because, on the one hand, I had thought of offering some very introductory comments on the book, not being quite aware who would be the audience, etc. But now the discussion is on certain, detailed issues. So I'll try to somehow merge both in a short comment. Well, first of all, Torstein's book is a Trinitarian in nature, as it were. What do I mean by that? On the one hand, it is an original contribution to the study of Maximus, however defined. So it's not compiled of things that we already knew, but new analysis, new arguments, etc. Secondly, however, it is also introductory, and we have a few books that raise that claim of being introductory in nature, but it's very important that this is a philosophically introductory book on Maximus as well. Not quite Maximus for Dummies book, because that would be impossible due to the very nature of Maximus's thought. And that's the third grand gesture, if one would put it thusly, by Torstein, is the bold claim that this is a book in the history of philosophy and on metaphysics, Christian metaphysics, which is a departure from how most people would write about Maximus and how most people would present their work. The gesture is bold, not because it is difficult to do something like that on the basis of Maximus, but because there is resistance in the audience and the limits, frontiers, and borders of the disciplines as these are currently furnished in academia. I, for example, have 12 decisions by Greek university professor committees that Maximus is neither a philosopher nor a theologian. 12 decisions by committees. Anyhow, so there is this boldness that, no, this is a book on Christian metaphysics and a book on the history of philosophy and where Maximus, as it were, fits in that. Now, what is the state of Maximus' studies, if one may put it thusly, and where does Torstein's book fit? Well, if we recall the American and European annual State of the Union address, let's put it as a state of the hypostatic union in this case. Contrary to common conviction, I would say that the field, where one to put it like that, is in its beginnings. Whereas, everybody's saying that currently there's a Maximus hype, everybody's talking about Maximus, etc., etc., etc. At some point, this will stop, this trend, everything that could be said will be said, etc. But quite rather than that, the business of translating Maximus into English has not been completed. Currently, the letters to Maximus are being translated, and we have the Ambigua and the Athalasium fairly recently in print by the indefatigable Maximus Constas. And it's not only Greek academics that cannot read the original Greek, also other nationalities have challenges with that. So you cannot say that there is that the field has reached its limits if even the primary texts are not yet available. Apart from that, there is this tension that Torstein also mentions in the book, that although today many people write about Maximus on different things, it's still that the will is being considered as Maximus's primary contribution. This is also a historical contingency which had to do with the doctrinal issues of the day. But as many have shown, and Torstein also with his Christocentric cosmology book and today's book, Maximus has a very comprehensive philosophy that is both not original in the bad sense, in the sense of having no lineage, having no pedigree before that, but it is indeed original and not simply a mashup of other voices, Christian and pagan alike. Torstein demonstrates that in the book in a very close manner. For example, by showing that the logoi have a pedigree, the logoi have a past in other thinkers, but what Maximus does is not simply a mashup of that. And I would argue that the logi issue is very central to what Maximus brings to the table. Another issue is that Maximus's work is also slightly sadistic in nature. What do I mean by that? That you have Aristotle on politics, the Republic by Plato, Aquinas writing a Summa, etc. You know where you will find that thinker's treatment of said issue. Maximus has this archipelago of letters, texts, etc., etc. So in order for somebody to be properly able, as Torstein eminently is, obviously, to speak about what Maximus brings to the table, one must have a very comprehensive overview of an archipelago of material. You cannot say Maximus treats that there, and so a scholar that is specialized in many things can take a look at Maximus and be able to opine about what Maximus says. So there are all these difficulties. And if Maximus is so rich in his thought, as many in this Zoom call think he is, then the field is nascent rather than moribund. So the book arrives at a very opportune timing, particularly in how it challenges this question of disciplines. And this question of disciplines, as also Torstein argues in the introduction, does not have to do with the nature of thinkers. And, you know, the issue of doctrine, as if Christians are mindless drones, exclusively adhering to a doctrine that somehow fell from the sky at a particular point, rather than being worked on for at least 7 centuries, philosophically and theologically alike. But it's also the, again, historical contingencies of Western historiography, etc. Today we have the canon, a certain canon, and the canon is not, there is no canon in the sense of analytic philosophy, because we don't deal with dead philosophers. But as far as non-exclusively analytical philosophy is concerned, we have a canon that is challenged from both ways, but not truly opened up, because you have the canon and then you open a space for non-Western philosophy, for Eastern philosophy, for global philosophy. But this is not opening up the canon. It's as if you have a big house and you have a huge luxurious restroom inside, but you also have a small WC for visitors you don't like. And when they need to, when nature calls, fishing, you tell them to go there. So there is much to be done in opening up the canon properly. Now, in the few minutes that remain, a very few words on certain things, taking into account this gesture that this is a work on the history of philosophy, etc. Obviously, Maximus's epistemology has unique elements, but it is not utterly unique as far as a late antique and Byzantine and classical even perspective is concerned, as to the fact that epistemology also lies in the eye of the beholder. What do I mean by that? We moderns and postmoderns or late moderns think that reality is out there in varying degrees, etc. And the question is simply finding it out. Whereas Maximus is and that era's epistemology has the change of one's own existence as a prerequisite. So you cannot acquire knowledge if you do not change. Otherwise, this knowledge is inaccessible. It's very easy to repeat that in a context of patristic studies, late antique philosophy, etc. But bringing this today as something that radically challenges how we today think of knowledge and the limits of our options and choices could be very efflorescent, very fecund, in a contemporary philosophical inquiry, not simply a history of philosophy of sorts. Of course, this changing oneself has many problems. Torstein reminds us in the book of Maximus's list of 50+ vices in the introduction to Athalagium. I took a look. I think I adhere to most of them. So epistemology might be very, very tricky in this context. Now, at some point, Torstein said that there are some people who do not like the logi being called ideas, and I felt his piercing glance in my, his piercing gaze in my spleen. If I have a moment, because this has been quite extensively discussed earlier, let me say why people like me, that is the ones with the 50 vices, are not content with that. First of all, obviously, both ideas and wills are by definition anthropomorphical conceptions, which are the only conceptions we have because hyperousios, because apophaticism, etc. The issue with ideas is, first of all, ideas pop up in your mind. You don't choose. There is no volition in an idea being engendered, even atemporally engendered, etc. To my mind, at least, it's important in Maximus that these are wills and intentions of God rather than ideas that simply pop up in his mind, in God's mind. Another issue is that, how should I put this? Of course, an idea is always an idea by somebody, but an idea of somebody. But we tend to ascribe to ideas self-existence as well, as it were. Whereas if we insist on something being a will, an intention, a volition of God, it is impossible for us to consciously or semi-consciously ascribe a self-existing entity to that thing, because in the context of the created-uncreated distinction, it is of cardinal importance that there are no uncreated things apart from God himself. There are no uncreated things. Deified persons are not new beings, new uncreated beings. They are created beings whose existence is, whose activities are being lent by the uncreated, as it were. So in this architecture by Maximus, between created universals, created substances, created hypostases, and uncreated logoi, which are not things, which cannot be reified, I believe that this persisting in the question of intentions and wills rather than ideas helps us not to lose sight of this non-reification of the logoi, as it were, the logoi. By the way, it's been years that Torstein has been discussing with colleagues and friends, and the one whom your present interlocutor is in the habit of defining by means of the perpendicular pronoun, concerning the question of whether there are logoi of things that will not exist. And there is a very particular argument about that in the book, that no, there is no Meinungs jungle of a repository of logoi that will not exist. When reading Torstein's argument, I was also thinking of the following, that one of the reasons that there cannot be logoi of things that will never exist is also that this would be logoi without a telos. In Maximus's thought, it is so important that the historical embodiment of being, the historical embodiment of beings between the pre-temporal, atemporal logoi intentions, creative intentions, and up until the eschaton, this historical embodiment is a pillar of the ontological status of things that are and of things that are not yet. So building up on Torstein's argument, because if I understood the text correctly, Torstein, you do argue that there cannot be logoi of things that will never exist, more or less. These logoi also, apart from all other things, would also be logoi without the possibility of a telos and without the possibility of a historical embodiment. So this would run counter to how Maximus conceptualizes things. Now I've talked for perhaps a bit too much, so a very last comment, but which would that be? Yes, because Zizoulas was brought up. Torstein strongly critiques two persons in the book, John Zizoulas, and on page 237, David Attenborough. The harshness of the criticism lies in the fact that Torstein does not acknowledge that Zizoulas is more of an expert in Maximus than David Attenborough. Anyhow, and a very last comment on could God have not created the world, although I'm eagerly looking forward to Budapest's paper. Not on the question itself, but on other things that were discussed here in this Zoom. The first of all is, I have a tough time with the very question of whether this is the best possible world. Possible compared to what? Because by posing this question, this is the beauty of apophaticism, that one knows that only certain things can be said concerning what is beyond the limit of createdness, and these only analogically. By wondering, A, whether God could have not created the world, and B, whether this is the best of possible worlds, one conceptualizes, as it were, mutatis mutandis, etc., God in a room before creating the world, with all the problems of temporality in this very conception, etc., thinking whether this will be created, and which of all possible words will be created. This is so far away from our experience as created beings, which is the only experience that we have. And our only way of speaking about God is analogically, and to the extent that God is in a way embodied in the world via the logoi, which as tesserae in a mosaic bring forth the logos, the person of the logos, that I think it would be an illicit question of sorts, etc. I like the book very much. I give it a 5-star rating. I think that's very good that this argument, that Maximus' thought is a comprehensive thinking that's not only bound by the historical contingencies that shed more light on the question of the will, of the two activities of Christ, etc. And then there is this claim, no, this is a chapter in the history of philosophy and a chapter in the history of metaphysics, and a chapter in metaphysics, not only the history of metaphysics, that could be very germane today for contemporary reasons, that could give us certain ways out from the impasses of our tools, which were based on a very particular canon. Okay, because another issue with Maximus is that one has to work hard to familiarize oneself with the precise context, not only of his terminology, but also of his pedigree's terminology. For example, there was a discussion, a very licit discussion, on comparisons with Aquinas, etc. But before approaching Maximus, one has to have in mind that he comes from a very different world, which plays by its own rules as far as how core concepts are conceptualized. So bringing this forth also as a bold contribution to philosophy is very nice. Thank you, Torstein. Two questions to Torstein. Two questions to Torstein.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Which area would you single out in which Maximus offers philosophically seminal, if not original, contributions, but which remains relatively understudied? The second question is, well, in many ways, one could say that the logoi are uncreated activities. In many ways, one could say that there is a differentiation. But because you hinted on that previously, in which way you would strongly differentiate the question of the logoi from divine activities? Because you spoke about activities ad extra, but there are also taperiton theon, which are divine activities, not necessarily ad extra.
First and foremost, thank you very much for these comments, Sotiris. I'm very happy that you enjoyed the book. And I don't think I shall comment on the things you said, because I think I mainly agree with a lot of it. And I also think that I'm a bit sorry that I didn't convince you that my understanding of the logoi as divine ideas is not reifying them. That maybe that could be for a later discussion, because that is, of course, the thing that I would like to avoid. Maybe that should have been discussed better in the book. It isn't discussed at all, as far as I can see.
May I interject just for a moment?
I point out that there is some kind of dynamic aspect of it, but I think I can answer your objections to that.
No, it's very clear to me that you're not reifying the logoi. What I was trying to say is that insisting on a wills, intentions, etc. vocabulary rather than ideas helps readers not be led to conclusions that are also counter to the book and to Maximus.
Okay, then I agree with you. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. And I see the point. That the reason why I use the term divine ideas is just to, so to say, come to the issue in a sense. That I know there were other interpretations of the logo out there, which I do not agree with. And I think that the Maximus logo somehow has some kind of relationship or some kind of family likeness with what you would think of as doctrines of divine ideas. But I think there are two aspects of it, namely that they are so-called predeterminations and divine acts of will, which is said in the Ambiguum 7. And as predeterminations, I think there has to be something that God has contemplated in himself. So to say, you could also think, of course, that an additional source for Maximus logo doctrine is the opening chapter of Genesis in the Septuagint, where God said, so there was a pronouncement, so to say, the logo are therefore something that is said, in a sense, pronounced by God. So I'm willing to see that dynamic in them. But as said, I think there are predeterminations, as it says in Ambiguum 7. He pronounced them as predeterminations, and he pronounced them in the act of creation, instantiating them in the cosmos. Then to say something about the aspects of Maximus that could be that we should investigate more. Wasn't that the first question you put? Yeah.
In which Maximus has a very important contribution, which has been studied heretofore.
Yeah, I think his doctrine of the universal. Because it seems to me that nobody has written about it than I have, than me. And I think it is a very important aspect of his understanding of creation and the cosmos as is constituted by creation, and which also opens possibilities for thinking environmental protection in a new way, which could be applied, I think, in our days. That is one of my very important idea of mine. So that is one aspect, I think. And also, as you said, that the Maximian studies maybe are in the start, the beginning. There's a lot to do. There is definitely a lot to do. Because it seems to me, for instance, I have written this book, and always when I have written something, when I put the last full stop or period, I think that, okay, was this satisfying? Was it clear enough? Are you sure about all this? Are there any objections? I mean, I immediately start to criticize myself. And I mean it when I say that each chapter in this book could have been a book on its own. And I'm very skeptical whenever someone presents something as the final answer to an investigation of a topic or an ancient author for that matter. So I agree that, and that reminds me about the story I told about Lars Thunberg in Oxford in the introduction or the preface to this book, that in the introduction, I think, that when his wife said, no, there can't be anything more to say about this guy. And Lars just seems to suggest that there is a lot more to be said about Maximus. I think that will be, yeah, that's my final contribution.
Yeah. Also knowing your thought on Maximus and many discussions, etc., I also had the same impression that so many things had to be left out from a chapter so that it could be a chapter rather than a book in itself. By the way, on new books, I said that the field is nascent, but many important things are being published now. For example, if I may say so, I think that Jordan Daniels Wood's book, Christ, the whole mystery of creation, is also a bold contribution to Maximus. Now, on substance and hypostasis, yes, I remember also in 10 years ago the holomerism paper And now I see in the chapter that you very clearly say so. You know, this is an issue that hasn't been worked with as extensively as it deserves. If I may say, there's also a further reason why it would be important to work more with that. It is because Maximus seems to really not care at all about the problem that later emerged in the West and dominated the very canon we have today between nominalism and realism. It seems that in the 7th century, nobody had informed Maximus that this is a problem and you have to take sides. So this idea that the universal, the substance, does exist, but it cannot exist if there is no particular. For example, if the last cat dies, the substance cat will stop existing. This is a kind of argument that balances between the two, does not negate the existence of the substance, but does not make it wholly independent from the particulars, from the hypostasis, that I think is quite alien to mainstream philosophical canon concerning these great battles in the Middle Ages, and not only, but and late antiquity in many ways. But he strikes a balance that I find unique in the way that he strikes it. And this hasn't worked with as much as one would hope for. I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, good.
Great. Anyone have any comments or questions for either Sotiris or Torstein? I mean, I guess
I'd like to ask
Jeff.
a follow-up on what Sotiris said about ability not to create. I'm wondering if you think that God creates through his will, what would you think of the line of reasoning that well, we can will not to act, and so if we're making analogical predication of God, we say God also has a will, so it seems like it might be plausible to say that he could will not to act in that sense.
Well, I didn't say that God was compelled to create the world. Quite the contrary, in the sense that there are two problems if one says explicitly God couldn't not have created the world. And I'm trying to tread lightly because, for the reasons explained before, I think there are very limited things one could say for such a so speculative a question. The first is that for Maximus, I think how I understand Maximus, it is crucial that there is an element of freedom, not only in the creation of the world, but in any activity of God. So this is the litmus test for the question whether God could have not created the world, etc. So it is important that this freedom is acknowledged, which means that yes, God could have not created the world, but etc. So, because if one takes that out, then a necessity is being introduced, and this is an odious necessity. At the same time, sorry, what was the my second thought? As a Maximian scholar, I have more wills than thoughts. So you see, I forgot my. The other problem is, while there is quite much Platonism and Neoplatonism, both in Christian philosophy and thinking generally, and in Maximus in particular, I think it's important to avoid whatever could end up with a notion of emanations, of the world emanating from God. So any idea, it's very hard for me to imagine somebody stating that God had to create the world without this ending in some sort of emanation. I somehow think that these two are correlated. And in order to avoid this is the second reason why I think that it's important to imagine, however speculative, that would be that no, there was no necessity on the part of God for creating the world, and God could have not created the world.
What do you think of
Yeah,
the?
I think, yeah. I was just going to say that the emanation thing there does seem to be something going on there, that there's a connection, but I'm not, yeah, there seems definitely.
And Torstein mentioned before the correlation between, which is a correlation, I think explicitly acknowledged by Maximus, between also God said and it was done. So this said is also the logoi literally, so as words. It's in the rare instances that this literal translation is correct. But this also presupposes an intention, and an intention is always something that could have not happened. You could have the intention not to, as you said. You could have the volition not to, in a certain sense. So also this Genesis background informs us of this intentional creation, which entails the possibility of its opposite, doesn't it? Another issue is the question of, sorry, Andrew wanted to make a statement.
Yes, if I may, I wanted to know what you thought of this suggestion, that the logoi are both ideas and wills, because if you stress will too much, it becomes a sheer act of power, which is arbitrary, adventitious, ad hoc, and indeed it finds itself in certain theologies, like very reformed theologies, which stress ex nihilo so much that God is almost rolling the dice and, hey presto, something crops up in creation that he hasn't even anticipated. I exaggerate, but that's what happens if you go all the way to will and stress that too much. Whereas if you stress ideas too much and reify them too much, then it does sound like it's uncontrolled emanation, and there's no difference between what's in God's mind and what exists in finite reality. So my rationale, this debate that you see in the literature, I try and reach this irenic compromise of saying that actually the logoi are both wills and ideas. In other words, wills that have intelligible content, which are based on the logos himself, since there is nothing else to base them on. So everything has to find its exemplar in the Godhead.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not explicitly saying that the logoi cannot also be understood as ideas. What I'm saying is that there is value in stressing the difference of the logoi system, as it were, with other notions of ideas in the divine mind in the history of thinking, philosophy, theology, you name it. And a very sharp distinction between wills and ideas here would be also too much of anthropomorphism, because what does ideas in God's mind mean? It also means something that God knows. But obviously, the logoi are something that God knows, and quite explicitly so in Maximus. So one cannot say that no, the logoi are not ideas in God's mind. One can say that it is important to stress other aspects because, for example, there's also the other thing, that the logoi altogether disclose the person of the logos. If one is fixated in the idea of ideas, it is difficult to see how this plays out. Whereas if one asserts that it's all of these things at once and none of them, because all of them are relative attempts at conceptualizing something which is uncreated and incidentally not a thing, so it has to do A, with the limits of all those words, and B, with what is it opportune to stress vis-a-vis other elements in the history of thinking, lest one immediately jumps into the conclusion that, oh, we've had that before, okay, logi, ideas in God's mind, we know how this plays out, okay, there's also a Christian thinker that appropriates it. The beauty of Maximus, as Torstein so eloquently says in the book as well, is that no, there's much more than that. etc. If I may say a very last thing, as far as I'm concerned, there was also an implicit discussion on universalism in the beginning, also by Sam, etc. As much as I would not like this to be the case, because it means that both Greek politicians and Greek academics will be unpunished in the end, there are many elements in Maximus's thought that point to that direction, to be honest. But if we accept that this is a possibility Maximus's thought, if I may, if I have 2 minutes, there is a different problem of sorts. It is the problem of identity. We have underscored in this discussion as well how important it is for Maximus the historical embodiment of beings, particularly rational beings and logical beings in the sense of human beings, between the initial logoi and the final eschaton and telos. So at the eschata, you do not have a return to factory settings negating everything that happened in between. You have a valorization of history brought together with a logoi and a tertium that is the eschata. Maximus says, in an attempt to salvage, as it were, Gregory of Nyssa on the apokatastasis, that all memories of evil and all evil works will be annihilated, all memories of evil. Let us imagine a person full of immense spite, malice, and wickedness, a European commissioner, for example. That person, if that person's historical existence is to have value, imagining that person arriving cleansed from all possible memories of evil and all possible works of evil, etc., one has to ask, in Maximian terms, were this to be the case, what would be the identity of that being? How can we conceptualize a recognizable identity of that being that has all of these elements that were so integral to that being's historical embodiment wiped away? So the problem is not whether Maximus is in principle open to a kind of restoration, a kind of apokatastasis, or whether we could interpret Maximus as such. The question is, if we do so, what happens then with the other elements in Maximus's thought, and how that would look like?
The same problem applies to how you see carnivores and parasites in the eschata. How, if you strip them of all of their malign attributes.
Yeah, that's a good point. That analogy between the loss of a wicked person's identity and the loss of the parasite or the carnivore's identity. Great. Well, does anyone? I mean, we're kind of approaching 2.5 hours here, so I want to be
May I
mindful.
ask one last thing?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I mean, I shouldn't ask this after being a student of Torstein and after having read and corrected the chapter on holomerism and universals, but since St. Maximus himself says that God creates universals, he says it somewhere, but I don't remember where. I wonder in what sense one has to take that literally, Torstein, since he also says that the frame of reference, the definition of the universal is a particular. It's a bit hard to think that he really means that God creates universals and that not to be attributed to St. Maximus as a Neoplatonic influence.
I think that means that he creates particulars as instantiating universal properties in the hierarchical order.
But then the notion of creating universals would be a kind of corollary, secondary. a necessary effect of.
Would be what?
A kind of corollary of necessary effect of the primary and the only creation of particulars.
I think there was no first and second here in the temporal sense. I think they are instantiated immediately.
Yeah. I mean, first and second in the sense of primacy, in the sense that, well, that which is created is the particular, primarily, so to say.
I think they are equiprimordial.
Yeah.
Equiprimordial, or whatever, a term I learned reading a translation of Martin Heidegger into English.
Great. Well, thank you for bringing that up, Panagiotis. Yeah, I guess we'll close here. And so first off, just thank you to our panelists, Torstein, Sotiris, and Jonathan. Thank you for your very insightful contributions today. And then, of course, special thanks to our audience for your engaging participation. That everyone has really enriched the discussion a lot. And so I wish everyone well till we meet again. And take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very
you.
much indeed.
Thank you.